So with cloth now fetching a higher price, even in England where you have a comparative disadvantage in the production of cloth, we're going to want to make more. Businesses are going to want to make more. And a higher price for cloth means a lower relative price for wine, so we're also going to have less wine production. Now, we've also got to figure out where we're consuming in all of this. So again, we want to find the highest country indifference curve that's just tangent to our new ISO value budget line. Let's put, by the way, the slope here is minus PC over PW1. Let's see, where will this be? I really didn't give myself enough room here. So with a higher relative price of cloth, we will be consuming less cloth and consuming more wine. And we end up at we're producing at point C and consuming at point D on a lower country indifference curve. So again, the terms of trade have deteriorated, and this also means that aggregate economic welfare has declined. Could it be now that we've had a reversal, as I've drawn? It's possible. It'd be weird, but it would be possible. I didn't mean to draw that, to have that reversal. But boy, I sure did, didn't I? On both sides. Yeah. Actually, it wouldn't work here unless, of course, it works on the other country as well. It is, but that's an interesting point. So I don't know if you in the back heard, but if you look at this, we started with England importing cloth, consuming more cloth than they're producing. And the way I drew it, inadvertently, was we ended up actually now producing more cloth than we're consuming. So we've gone from an importer to an exporter. At least I was consistent on the vertical axis as well, where we've gone from being an exporter to being an importer. It's unlikely to happen, but it is possible that relative price changes can move you from being an importer to an exporter or vice versa.
So that doesn't change the trade?
No.
So even if that happens,
Well, this would now be our initial condition, right? So if we talk about another change in relative prices, their terms, the way we would measure England's terms of trade going forward, if this is now our initial condition, is PC over PW, because they're now Portugal. Well, that's what I said. I inadvertently, that means mistakenly, drew this. Okay, so I did not mean to show that this was going to switch England from an importer to an exporter of cloth. If that were to happen, if that was the change in the relative prices, it would also have to affect the other country, right? You can't have two countries exporting cloth to nobody else if it's only a two-country. Well, I guess Mars can take some imports. Yes. No, I can't think of a situation. Remember, one of the things that we've seen is that trade expands your consumption possibilities. The only question would be, how much does it change your consumption possibilities? So if it doesn't change it very much, maybe you don't care. Or you might have transportation costs that offset that expanded consumption possibilities because you've got other costs involved. But as long as international trade leads to more specialization, division of labor, more specialization, therefore increased world output, each country should be better off with international trade, regardless of what happens to the terms of trade. Now notice they're worse off than they were before, but notice they're still consuming outside of their production possibilities frontier. So they're still better off than they would have been in autarky. No, you'd make it flatter. Right. So notice that if it's flatter, you won't be producing as much cloth. Right. So if this curve is flatter, it means that the relative price of cloth did not rise as much. So what you want to keep it as a net importer of cloth is for consumption of cloth, output of cloth to come here, and for consumption of cloth not to fall as much. So a flatter ISO value budget line would be the way to go.
I'm not sure about how true this is in real life, but based on structural test, if the relative price increases to enough extent, we can actually go back to the same CIC. Just that. If it becomes steep enough, you can go back to the same CIC just based on the graph. But
No, it won't actually.
okay.
Yeah, it won't. You'll be way down here. Okay, yes? Lower aggregate economic welfare. Right. So remember, we've got a whole family of indifference curves here, increasing in welfare as we move away from the origin. So anytime you've moved to a lower, meaning back towards the origin, indifference curve, the level of economic welfare has been reduced. And of course, hopefully this whole terms of trade thing makes some logical sense too, right? How does Portugal gain from international trade? The fact that they're really efficient at making cloth, and the price of cloth, which they're selling to the rest of the world, went up in price. So they're actually being able, with the same resources, to generate the same amount of cloth if they wanted. They would still have higher incomes because they're selling that cloth at a higher price. And now, of course, they're going to be even producing more of it. So that higher income or that higher revenue that they're generating from selling more cloth at higher prices allows them to buy more wine. England, on the other hand, has just the opposite situation, right? They are not particularly efficient at producing cloth, and yet the price of cloth has gone up. So in a relative sense, they now need to give away more wine, which they're relatively good at producing, in order to get the same amount of cloth. So they're going to be worse off.
if there was a differentiation in Portugal currency and appreciation in English currency, would the graph look similar?
None of these graphs have anything to do with currencies directly.
Price? Okay.
Directly.
So I say that with international trade, both countries will gain, but due to relative price change, the gain for England will decrease.
Yes.
And the gain for Portugal will increase.
Yes. Okay. So that's exactly what we're saying. countries gain from international trade. That was the whole point of the Ricardian model and even the Heterolan specific factors model, is engaging in international trade expands your consumption possibilities. So countries can consume more while engaging in international trade than they can without engaging in international trade. Now, if you're in international trade and you're enjoying all of these great gains from international trade, and now you have another change in relative prices, then if it's a positive terms of trade, an increase in your terms of trade, you've got an extra gain over and above what you started with. And if it goes against you, as it did in England's case, you have a subtraction of the gains that you had earlier received. But you're still better off than you would have been in our Turkey.
So the first thing, when you look at your country benefit the world, there's different countries.
Well, sure. So the question was, even though the country gains overall, isn't it true that some sectors of the economy could gain more or less than the other? Well, that was the whole point of the Heterolan and specific factors model, right? Was to show that there are income distribution effects, that the economy itself may be better off. It has expanded consumption possibilities. That does not mean that every individual in the economy is better off, only in the aggregate.
Does the change in demand cause change in prices or the other way around? What's causing these changes?
Oh, we don't know yet. We'll go through a couple of examples, though, today, for the rest of today and tomorrow, that will change relative prices, things that are other than what we've considered so far.
So when demand changes, like in this country, does that change another? Does that change prices again?
Well, something has to happen to cause the change in relative prices, right? So where do relative prices come from? The intersection of a relative supply, world relative supply, and world relative demand curves. So if something causes the world relative demand curve or the world relative supply curve to shift, then you're going to get a change in relative prices, which will cause the ISO value budget lines to change, and therefore the increase and or decrease aggregate economic welfare in the countries involved. So we'll go through a number of examples of how relative prices can change and whether it is a function of changes in relative supply or changes in relative demand. So, but don't confuse. While we know that a shift in the relative demand curve will cause relative prices to change, that doesn't mean that a change in relative prices causes a shift in the relative demand curve. Right? That change is generally a movement along the relative demand curve. Okay, so we can now put together what is generally referred to as the standard trade model, which consists of the following components: the world relative supply curve, the world relative demand curve, which of course generates the world equilibrium relative price. We also want to have the country's production possibilities frontiers, indifference curves, ISO value lines, budget lines, all that kind of good stuff. And we need to understand the relationship between the terms of trade and economic welfare. So that's what we're looking at. Now we want to take two examples of, or maybe three examples of issues that could cause changes in either the relative supply curve, the world relative supply curve, or the world relative demand curve. So today what we want to look at is what happens if we have economic growth, right? I mean, over time countries grow. And so we want to see what the effect of that will be, both domestically on the economy, as well as does it have any implications for the country's terms of trade, and therefore its level of economic welfare. I hope the answer is yes. It's not. We can call the rest of this lecture macroeconomics. And then on Thursday, we'll look at two other things that can have an effect on either the world relative supply or the world relative demand curve. We'll look at tariffs, and we'll look at export subsidies, two things that government policy can have an influence on. In terms of economic growth, we want to look at that and see, first of all, what is the effect of economic growth on the production possibilities frontier? And then we want to look at just the domestic effects, without worrying about any international effects, just how do we analyze this in terms of the domestic effects that are taking place. Then once we've got the domestic effects taken out of the way, we can look at the international effects. How does this affect the world relative supply and demand curve, therefore the terms of trade, therefore the level of aggregate economic welfare? So that's where we're going here. So the first thing to recognize is that economic growth is actually going to shift the production possibilities frontier outwards. Right? As the economy grows, its ability to produce goods and services has also expanded. So the production possibilities curve is moving out. Now, if we thought about that in the sense of the Ricardian model, it would simply be, well, gee, workers become more productive. All workers become more productive. So again, the production possibilities frontier would shift out. If we thought about it in terms of the Heterolan model with factor endowments, all we would say is, oh, we've got more of some factor. It might be more labor, it might be more capital, it might be more natural resources, whatever it might be. And that would also shift the production possibilities frontier in an outward direction. So thinking about our quadrants and how we derived our production possibilities frontier to begin with, we can show that typically the direction of growth has a bias associated with it. So we talk about that with respect to the Heterolan model. Remember we said, for instance, the machinery was capital intensive and cloth or apparel was labor intensive. So needless to say, if the country got a lot more capital, then its production possibilities frontier would shift out. But that capital really wouldn't help us produce a lot more cloth, but it would help us produce a lot more machinery. If we got more labor, it would help us produce a lot more cloth. But since machinery was capital intensive, if the capital stock hasn't changed, we'd only get a little bit more capital or machinery produced. So we can think here then of cloth as capital intensive and wine as land intensive. So if somehow this country, I think this looks like Portugal, but may not be. So if this country, whatever it is, we'll call it Portugal, somehow managed to acquire more capital, so its capital stock increased, and had either a bunch of foreign direct investment or it had lots of savings and investment going on, so the capital stock increased. What we would see then is that the production function for cloth would shift out, cloth being capital intensive, some of the capital could be used in the wine production. So the output of wine would also increase, but not nearly as much. And so when we figure out what our new production possibilities frontier looks like, what we would see is that there is a biased outward shift in the production possibilities frontier. So this is our new PPF. Okay. And obviously, if we had gotten somehow a whole lot more land, we had cleared all the forest and put all the sulfates in the ground to grow more grapes, then presumably the production possibility or the production function for wine would shift up much more than the production function for cloth would shift down. So if we think about growth biased towards cloth, so the production possibilities frontier moves out in a biased direction. In here, we also want to invoke, for the moment, the Rybinski theorem. So who remembers the Rybinski theorem? Generally. Anybody want to take a guess? Okay, so what the Rybinski theorem said is, let's hold relative prices constant to see what the effect will be on the production of the two goods under consideration. He did not say relative prices would not change. What he did say is, suppose that relative prices don't change, what can we say about relative production of goods and services? And what he showed is, at the same slope, that we would get a disproportionate increase in the output of cloth and an outright decline in the output of wine. Okay. So notice then that the quantity of wine, the supply of cloth versus the supply of wine definitely increases. Right? At this relative price, we can see that the relative quantity of cloth produced has increased. So skipping ahead a few, what happens here? So Portugal has experienced growth that has been biased towards cloth. Somehow they've managed to get a lot more capital or any of the other factors of production that are particularly important to cloth production. So at the same relative price, Portugal is now producing a higher relative quantity of cloth. I'm sorry? So the relative supply increases. What does that mean? Oh, okay. So the relative supply, world relative supply, shifts to the right. Right? Notice, at the same relative price, this is what the Rybinski theorem says, at the same relative price, we'll get a disproportionate increase in the output of cloth and an outright decline in the output of the other good. So we could show that simply by shifting the world relative supply curve to the right. Yes?
What's the scope of that? Some of the world relative supply is going to change slope, and not more bias,
Don't know. Don't really care. It won't be relevant for what we'll do. It may be relevant if you wanted absolute numbers in all of this, and you'd have to estimate what all these slopes look like. But for what we want to show, it doesn't really matter whether it changes slopes or not. Okay, so what does happen? What relative price goes down? Of cloth. The world equilibrium relative price of cloth declines. Right? So notice our new equilibrium